Tonight we turn our attention to one of the most quietly astonishing ideas in the whole of human imagination: the generation ship. A vessel conceived not merely to carry a crew across the cosmos, but to carry an entire way of life. Something so immense it would function as its own small world. Something so slow in the face of interstellar distances that the people who step aboard at departure would be long gone by the time the ship finally neared its destination. The ones who arrive would be the great-grandchildren of the ones who left. Perhaps further removed than that, it may, in the end, be the only real path we ever have toward reaching another star. But sit with that for a moment, because the question underneath all of it is genuinely worth considering. Could a single enclosed vessel, carrying everything it will ever have from the moment it launches, keep thousands of human beings alive, healthy, fed and whole for centuries? With no possibility of emergency supply, no rescue if things went wrong, and no turning back once a certain point had been passed? By the time our gentle journey together this evening draws to a close, you will have a clear and quietly thorough understanding of what it would truly require to keep such a ship going, what forces would work slowly against it, and how long, realistically, one could hold together in the dark between the stars. And if this kind of quiet exploration of deep space is something you find yourself returning to, a like or a subscription means a great deal to this channel. It helps more curious minds find their way here. Now, very gently, let us begin. The star closest to our own sun is called Proxima Centauri. It lies at a distance of roughly 25 trillion miles from the Earth. If you were to travel aboard Voyager 1, the swiftest human-made object ever to depart the solar system, moving at around 38,000 miles per hour, the journey to Proxima Centauri would take something on the order of 70,000 years. And that is the nearest option we have. If the destination needs to be a star with more promising conditions for a world that could actually support human life, the distances involved climb quickly. 10 light years away. 20, 50, 100. The physics of space does not adjust itself to accommodate how urgently we might want to close those gaps. Even a propulsion system of the most advanced kind we can currently conceive, something operating on nuclear pulse principles or fusion, would push a ship to only a small fraction of the speed of light, a few percent if everything went perfectly. At that pace, Proxima Centauri itself is still decades away, and a destination with genuinely promising conditions might lie a century or two further still. And here is the thing that rarely gets said with full plainness. There is no faster path anywhere near the horizon. Warp drives remain mathematical constructs, intriguing on paper, with no engineering route toward physical reality. Wormholes exist in the equations, but have not appeared in any form we can actually reach or use. The speed of light is not a ceiling we are close to touching. So if there is ever to be a moment when human beings, not probes, not radio signals, but actual living people, travel to another star, that journey will almost certainly outlast any single human life. That is not a problem you solve by improving the engine. It is a problem you solve by building something that functions as a civilization rather than a vehicle. Something capable of sustaining itself, of raising children, of carrying knowledge and culture and biology forward across however many generations it takes to arrive. That is the generation ship. And it is, in truth, a far stranger and more demanding thing than it might first appear. It asks human beings to live out their entire lives within a sealed structure of metal and light, surrounded on every side by emptiness. No outside help if something goes wrong, no rescue, no possibility of turning back once a certain threshold of the voyage has been crossed. Whatever the ship departs with is all it will ever have. No deliveries. No restocking, no emergency response from the civilization that built and launched it. Only the people, the biological systems, the machines, and the long dark between the stars. The idea itself is not a recent one. Scientists and visionary thinkers have been gently wrestling with this concept for nearly 100 years. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian scientist who was quietly working out the mathematics of rocketry in the early 20th century, was among the first to suggest that crossing interstellar space might require vessels designed not as transports for a temporary crew, but as long-term homes for entire populations. Robert Goddard, the American rocket pioneer, was exploring similar territory in the 1920s. By the middle of the last century, both writers and researchers had begun mapping out in serious terms what such a ship might look like and what it would need. At its core, the concept is uncomplicated to describe. You construct something large enough to hold a stable, self-sustaining human population. You equip it with everything necessary to endure the full duration of the voyage. You send it in the direction of a destination star. And then time passes. Generations pass. Children are born aboard and grow old. The ship continues. At the far end of a journey measured in human lifetimes, the descendants of the people who originally stepped aboard find themselves in a new star system. Simple to state. Extraordinarily difficult to actually accomplish. Because each of those requirements, a stable population, systems that sustain themselves, a voyage that is survived in full, carries within it a chain of interconnected engineering, biological, social, and philosophical challenges that no civilization has ever had to face, all at once. The first and most foundational of those challenges is power. A generation ship needs energy for everything it does, moving through space, keeping the interior warm and breathable, cycling air and water, growing food, operating medical equipment, running every manufactured system that keeps people alive. And on a generation ship, there is no possibility of resupply. Whatever energy system is built into the vessel at the start must endure for the entire voyage. There is no service station at the midpoint, no opportunity to pause and reassess. The power system is permanent from the moment of departure. Nuclear fission, with technology that either already exists or is within plausible reach, is the most credible answer with what we currently know. Fission reactors can produce enormous quantities of energy from modest amounts of fuel. A well-designed reactor running on enriched uranium or thorium could, in principle, continue operating for centuries without the fuel itself needing replacement. Naval fission reactors, the kind that run submarines and aircraft carriers, already operate continuously for 20 to 25 years without refueling. A generation ship would require something with a much longer service life, but the engineering principles are real and well understood. What would be required is a set of multiple redundant reactor systems, each with backup power capability for the most critical functions, careful shielding against the radiation those reactors produce, and, crucially, the ongoing maintenance of those reactors by people who understand them deeply across every generation of the voyage. That last requirement is where the difficulty truly lives. Knowledge does not pass automatically from parent to child. A reactor specialist trains a group of apprentices. Those apprentices become specialists and train the next group. But every time understanding moves from one generation to another, there is a real possibility that something small and essential will be lost in the transfer. A technique that feels obvious to someone who has worked with these systems for 30 years might never be written down precisely because it seems too self-evident to record. 3 generations later, that understanding has quietly vanished. Or worse, someone holds an imperfect version of it and acts on that imperfect version in a moment when accuracy is everything. The systems that keep everyone alive do not accept gaps in expertise kindly. Fusion propulsion remains theoretically superior, but practically out of reach for now. Fusion, the same process at work inside every star, releases vastly more energy per unit of fuel than fission. If controlled fusion for power generation is ever achieved, which has been somewhat wryly described as 30 years away for the past 60 years, it would transform the mathematics of an interstellar voyage entirely. The fuel for a fusion reactor might even be gathered directly from the space the ship travels through. Hydrogen exists at very low densities throughout the interstellar medium, and a design concept proposed by physicist Robert Bussard in 1960, called the ramjet, suggested that a ship could scoop this hydrogen as it flew, feeding it continuously into a fusion drive. The practical challenges with that concept are significant. The magnetic scoop required to collect enough hydrogen would need to span hundreds of miles. The hydrogen itself is quite sparse, and the drag produced by gathering it may, calculations suggest, actually work against the thrust rather than supplementing it. The idea has not been completely set aside, but it faces well-founded skepticism. Antimatter propulsion is even more energetically concentrated. When matter and antimatter meet, they annihilate each other completely and release pure energy. Nothing in known physics gets more out of a given quantity of mass. But producing antimatter in any useful quantity requires staggering amounts of energy to begin with. It does not occur naturally anywhere we can reach, and storing it, keeping it from touching ordinary matter and triggering immediate annihilation, represents one of the most formidable engineering problems imaginable. The honest conclusion for a generation ship built within any plausible near-future window is that nuclear fission is what keeps the lights on. And keeping those fission reactors functioning for 2 or 5 centuries, maintained by people who were not yet born when they were assembled, is one of the most fundamental challenges the whole enterprise must address before anything else can be considered. Everything depends on it. Suppose, for a moment, the power question is resolved. The next necessity is air. Human beings breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. In any sealed environment, do this long enough without active intervention, and the oxygen depletes while carbon dioxide builds toward toxic concentrations. On the International Space Station, this is managed through electrolysis, using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, alongside chemical scrubbers that draw carbon dioxide out of the air continuously. These systems serve a crew of 6 or 7 aboard a station that remains in low Earth orbit, close enough that supply missions arrive with reassuring regularity. A generation ship has no such proximity to support. Its air recycling would need to sustain not half a dozen people, but potentially thousands, without any external input, for centuries at a stretch. The most credible approach for genuinely long-duration viability is a closed-loop biological system. Plants, algae, photosynthetic organisms of various kinds that take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen in return. The same basic process that rendered Earth's own atmosphere breathable over deep geological time. A growing area of sufficient size, carefully managed, could in theory sustain breathable air for a sizable human population indefinitely, running on light and biology alone. This is not purely speculative. In the early 1990s, an experiment called Biosphere 2 was constructed in the Arizona desert specifically to test these principles. 8 people lived inside a sealed structure for 2 years, growing their own food, recycling their air and water through living biological systems, attempting to function as a self-contained world. It encountered serious difficulties. Oxygen levels fell unexpectedly as microorganisms in the soil consumed more than the designers had anticipated. Carbon dioxide fluctuated in ways that proved difficult to control. Some species thrived while others declined, and the ecosystems within the sealed structure behaved quite differently from what the models had predicted. Before the first year was complete, supplemental oxygen had to be introduced from outside to keep the people safe. Biosphere 2 is not a story of failure, though. It is something more valuable than that. It is a story of learning. It revealed clearly and in detail just how astonishingly complex a sealed biological system actually is. How many feedback loops and interdependencies exist within it that are invisible until you close the door and watch what unfolds. A generation ship would require biological life support systems orders of magnitude more sophisticated and more thoroughly understood than Biosphere 2 attempted. Not merely plants, but entire functioning ecosystems. Soil communities with their bacteria and fungi processing nutrients and breaking down organic waste. Insects or other organisms to handle pollination and decomposition. Algae systems capable of rapidly adjusting oxygen output as the population's needs vary over time. multiple redundant biological pathways so that when one component struggles, others can compensate without destabilizing the whole. The challenge here is not simply building those systems. It is understanding them deeply enough that when something unexpected happens, the people responsible for air quality can respond effectively. And across a voyage of centuries, something unexpected will certainly happen, many times over. The person managing the ship's biological life support in the 6th generation cannot call a specialist on Earth. They need genuine ecological understanding, diagnostic capability, and the ability to intervene in a biological crisis using only what the ship contains. That requires a depth of knowledge that our civilization currently spreads across thousands of specialist researchers and institutions, compressed into a community of a few thousand people and transmitted reliably across generations. Water is somewhat more tractable than air, but no less critical. In a properly sealed system, water can be recycled with very high efficiency. The moisture in every exhaled breath can be captured and reclaimed. Urine can be processed and returned to the system. The International Space Station already recovers more than 90% of water from urine through a multi-stage filtration and distillation process that runs continuously for years. Wastewater from food growing and daily life can be cleaned and recirculated. In principle, the same water molecules could cycle through the ship indefinitely. In practice, every recycling process carries some loss. Filtration materials degrade over time. Some water becomes bound up in biological waste that does not fully decompose. Some is lost through processes that are difficult to eliminate entirely. The ship would need reserves substantial enough to buffer those losses across the whole voyage, and it would need its water recycling infrastructure to function reliably and continuously. Because a genuine failure of the water systems, not a gradual decline but a complete breakdown, becomes a crisis within days. The redundancy requirements for water are extreme. Every component that could fail needs a backup. Every backup needs its own backup, and all of those systems need to remain serviceable by people who may be working with hardware that was assembled centuries before they were born. Spare parts are finite. The ability to manufacture new components extends the life of everything, but manufacturing itself requires raw materials and the expertise to use them. A generation ship would likely need to carry substantial quantities of raw material, not just as finished spares, but as the feedstock to create new spares once the original inventory is exhausted. And people who know how to make what is needed. Food is perhaps the most intimate of the survival requirements, woven through culture and memory and daily life in ways that water and air, for all their necessity, are not. On a generation ship, every calorie that every person consumes has to come from something grown, cultivated, or synthesized within the hull of the vessel. No deliveries. No external environment to draw from. No hunting or gathering outside. The agricultural systems would likely center on high-yield, space-efficient crops. Wheat, rice, potatoes, soybeans, sweet potatoes, leafy greens. the plants that provide the most nutrition relative to the area they require. Hydroponic and aeroponic systems, where plants grow in carefully managed water or fine mist rather than traditional soil, use both space and water more efficiently than conventional agriculture. Let grow lighting tuned to the specific wavelengths that photosynthesis actually uses makes indoor farming feasible in an environment where power has to be carefully managed. The International Space Station has grown lettuce and radishes using precisely these methods, with genuinely encouraging results. But feeding 6 people with a compact hydroponic garden is a very different engineering problem from feeding several thousand people across multiple centuries. Soil-based agriculture would likely be necessary as well. Real soil, with its community of microorganisms, provides a resilience and complexity that hydroponic systems alone cannot fully replicate for all crop types. It also plays a role in the broader biological life support systems, processing nutrients and supporting the microbial communities that the air and water recycling depend on in turn. A generation ship would probably need significant agricultural decks. Not purely industrial food production operations, but something closer to living, breathing ecosystems that could be managed, adapted, and maintained by people who understood farming as a practice rather than a procedure to follow from a document. Animals introduce their own complexity. Livestock require considerable space, water, and food relative to the nutrition they return. They generate waste that must be managed, and they have their own health needs requiring veterinary attention. And yet they provide not just protein, but fats, vitamins, and micronutrients that plants alone deliver imperfectly. More practically, they offer nutritional redundancy. If a grain harvest fails in a given cycle, the availability of animals as an alternative food source could be the difference between a manageable difficulty and a genuine crisis. Smaller animals, chickens, rabbits, and insects in particular, are far more resource efficient than larger livestock. Insects can convert organic waste into protein with remarkable efficiency. They require minimal space, reproduce rapidly, and contribute meaningfully to nutrition without placing heavy demands on the ship's overall food system. Fish and shellfish in enclosed aquaculture, hardy species such as tilapia and carp that have been successfully raised in closed systems on Earth, could provide another layer, converting algae and plant waste into protein while integrating with the biological recycling systems rather than operating separately from them. No single food source would carry the whole burden. The nutritional architecture of the ship would have to be a web of interlocking production systems, each one supporting the others, each capable of absorbing some degree of failure in the rest without triggering a collapse. And the people managing those systems would need to understand not just their own piece of the whole, but how each piece connects to everything else. Medicine deserves its own careful consideration, because medicine is an area where the gap between what is needed and what is realistically available widens significantly over time. A generation ship at departure would carry physicians, surgeons, specialists across multiple fields. It would carry pharmaceutical supplies, surgical tools, diagnostic equipment. But pharmaceuticals expire. Surgical instruments wear with use. Diagnostic tools require calibration and eventually replacement. And the medical knowledge aboard must cover for centuries everything that a planetary civilization with hospitals and specialist centers and pharmaceutical supply chains would normally manage. On Earth, if someone develops a rare condition or needs a highly complex procedure, they travel to a center of excellence. They are treated by specialists who have spent decades developing depth in that precise area. A generation ship cannot sustain that degree of specialization. Its population is too small. The time required to produce a neurosurgeon or a cardiac specialist is too long relative to how many of any given specialty the ship can support. There will be gaps in coverage, and those gaps will eventually encounter patients who need precisely what is missing. Pharmaceutical synthesis capability is one partial answer. A ship equipped to produce medicines from basic chemical feedstocks can maintain a supply of critical drugs indefinitely, provided it has the raw materials and the expertise to use them. Biotechnology, the ability to produce biological medicines such as antibiotics, vaccines, and hormone therapies, adds another layer. Gene therapy and targeted treatments could potentially address conditions that would otherwise be untreatable in a resource-constrained environment. But all of it must be sustained across generations of medical professionals who trained and practiced entirely within the ship, with no hospitals beyond its walls to turn to. The biological systems are demanding, but they are at least physical systems that can be studied, tested, modeled, and refined by engineers and scientists. The more difficult problem, the one that most serious generation ship proposals have struggled most to address fully, is not the biological one. It is the human one. What happens, quietly and over time, to people who spend their whole lives within a sealed metal world, surrounded by the same few thousand individuals, with nowhere to look but a horizon that curves back toward itself? Human beings did not develop in an environment like this. We arose on open grasslands and in forests, in landscapes that shifted with weather and season, within social groups embedded in a vast and varied natural world. Our minds are shaped by open horizons, by the smell of rain and the passage of seasons, by the sensory richness of a living planet that varies endlessly in ways too numerous to catalogue. A generation ship offers none of that. The overhead is metal. The horizon is a curved wall. There are no seasons except those the ship's systems choose to simulate. No weather except what the ventilation produces. No outside. Whatever is visible through any viewport is the same deep dark with the same stars, shifting almost imperceptibly across the decades and centuries of the voyage, never changing in any way that a human mind on any ordinary day would notice. The research literature on extreme confinement and isolation is, in this context, worth sitting with carefully. Studies of Antarctic winter over cruise, the small teams of scientists who remain at southern polar research stations through months of complete darkness and isolation, consistently document what researchers call winter over syndrome, a kind of diffuse low-level psychological strain that accumulates over the months of confinement. Slowed cognition, emotional flattening, irritability and interpersonal friction, measurable declines in memory and concentration, a certain greyness that settles over the group as the isolation extends. And crucially, those people know they are going home. They know the supply plane arrives in spring. They know the confinement ends. A generation ship removes that certainty entirely. The people aboard understand in a way that never goes away that the ship is not a temporary situation. It is their entire world, permanently for the rest of their lives. They will not walk on open soil beneath an open sky. They will not feel rain. They will not go anywhere that their neighbours have not also been. The social pressure that accumulates in an environment like this, high density, high stakes, with no possibility of real distance or escape, has no perfect analogy in current human experience. Submarines come close, Antarctic stations come close, isolated research outposts come close. All of these environments produce characteristic patterns of stress and interpersonal difficulty after extended confinement, and all of those environments end. The submarine surfaces. The Antarctic rotation comes. For a generation ship, there is no surfacing, no rotation, no end except the destination which the vast majority of the people who will ever live aboard will never reach. Small communities under pressure can become deeply connected, resilient in their mutual reliance, bound by the kind of trust that only long-shared difficulty can produce. That is one possibility. The other is fracture. Factions forming along real or perceived lines of difference. Grievances building without adequate resolution. Trust eroding slowly until the social fabric is more fragile than it appears from outside. Conflicts that in a different kind of life could be resolved by one person simply moving away and beginning again have nowhere to go on a ship. You cannot leave. The person with whom something went badly yesterday is at the same table this evening and the evening after that for the rest of your life. The governance of such a community would need to include genuine mechanisms for conflict resolution. Not merely rules with consequences, but processes by which people can feel genuinely heard, by which real grievances find paths toward genuine resolution, by which the damage that conflict does to a closed community can be repaired rather than allowed to accumulate. Without those processes, conflicts in a sealed population do not dissipate the way they sometimes can in open societies. They remain in the room with everyone. The governance question, perhaps surprisingly, receives less attention in technical discussions of generation ships than the reactor design or the life support systems. And yet it may matter more than either of those. The founding generation who boards the ship has chosen this. They understand what they are committing to. They voted for the command structure, signed the founding charter, accepted the terms of the mission. Their children made no such choice. Their grandchildren made none. And the people who finally arrive 300 years after departure are living under a social contract they had absolutely no part in writing. Subject to obligations established by ancestors, they may view with considerably less authority than those ancestors assumed they would be granted. The Mayflower Compact, signed aboard the Mayflower in 1620, was an attempt to address something distantly similar. A small group of people departing from established authority, sailing toward an uncertain destination, trying to create a workable framework for governing themselves in a situation that nobody had fully anticipated. It was a single page long, and it served well enough for a single Atlantic crossing. A generation ship would require something vastly more sophisticated, a framework that could evolve as circumstances changed across centuries, something that gave the actual living population, not the founders, not the mission planners on a planet that is now unreachably distant, genuine authority over their own community and their own lives, but also something that preserved the mission itself. Because if the third generation decides, by democratic process, to stop the ship and convert it into a permanent habitat station rather than continuing to the destination, the mission ends. The tension between what the living generation wants and what the founding generation committed everyone to is a genuine and deep philosophical problem. It connects to questions about intergenerational justice and the nature of consent that political philosophers have debated for centuries without reaching settled agreement. On a generation ship, those questions cannot be deferred. They must be built into the structure of the society before departure, with sufficient flexibility to accommodate the changes that centuries of living will inevitably require. Some researchers have proposed a layered constitutional structure, a core of principles that cannot be altered by any vote, those that protect the mission's fundamental requirements and the basic rights of everyone aboard, and a larger body of law and governance that can be legitimately revised by the living population as circumstances develop. The challenge is deciding which principles belong in the inalterable core, and ensuring that the inalterable category does not quietly become a mechanism for the founding generation's preferences to permanently override the autonomy of everyone who comes after. There is no perfect answer. But the generation ship that never thinks carefully about this question has already, before it launches, planted the seeds of a governance crisis that could surface at any point in the voyage. The genetic question is more biological than political, but it carries implications just as serious. Genetic diversity is the underlying reservoir of resilience in any population. When a disease appears, when environmental conditions shift, when any new challenge arises, it is the variation within the population that gives it the capacity to respond. Some individuals will be more resistant, some more adaptable. That variation is the mechanism of survival. Reduce it too far and harmful recessive traits accumulate, fertility declines, immune function weakens, and the population begins a slow deterioration that is very difficult to reverse once it is underway. This is not a theoretical risk. It has been documented in real, isolated human communities on Earth, in island populations and geographic isolates where limited contact with outside groups produced measurable genetic effects across generations. Population geneticists who study minimum viable crew sizes for long-duration space voyages have produced estimates that are worth pausing on. One widely discussed analysis suggested that a founding population of around 40,000 individuals would be needed for a voyage of several hundred years, accounting for the possibility of catastrophic events, for the natural fluctuations of population over time, and for maintaining sufficient diversity to keep the population genetically healthy on arrival. That number is not a maximum. It is a conservative minimum. Smaller founding populations are possible if reproduction is carefully managed, ensuring that no particular genetic lineage becomes overrepresented. That pairings are arranged in ways that maximize diversity. That the population avoids bottlenecks in any single generation. But this requires a kind of social engineering around reproduction that would sit uncomfortably with people who hold reproductive autonomy as a fundamental value. It asks people to weigh the genetic health of the whole community as a consideration in deeply personal decisions about family and partnership. Some proposed solutions involve carrying a large library of frozen genetic material, sperm, egg cells, or embryos from Earth donors, representing enormous diversity, far beyond what any reasonably sized crew could carry within their living bodies. These could introduce fresh genetic material at intervals throughout the voyage, supplementing the natural reproduction of the crew and preventing the gradual narrowing that isolation inevitably produces in small populations. The technology to do this exists in basic form. Cryopreservation of human reproductive material is already routine medical practice. Keeping frozen samples viable for centuries involves challenges that current technology has not yet fully resolved. But the principle is sound, and the technical obstacles, while real, do not appear to be permanently insurmountable. The physical vessel itself faces threats from outside that no mission planner can fully anticipate. Cosmic radiation is a constant presence in interstellar space. The magnetic field and atmosphere of the Earth shield us from most of the radiation that streams through the solar system. A generation ship traveling through the space between stars has neither. Galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles accelerated by supernovae and other energetic processes across the galaxy, pass through almost any practical thickness of shielding. They move through metal, through the ship's interior, and through the bodies of the people inside, depositing ionizing energy in tissue as they go. Over a voyage measured in centuries, radiation exposure is not a risk to be minimized and then forgotten. It is a certainty that must be designed around from the beginning. The most effective practical shielding against this kind of radiation is mass. Dense material between the occupants and the outside. Water is a good shield for certain particle types, and storing the ship's water supply in tanks that encircle the habitation areas gives that water a double purpose. Life support resource and radiation protection simultaneously. Lead and polyethylene are also effective for certain radiation types. But every kilogram of shielding added is a kilogram that must be accelerated to operational speed and decelerated at the destination. Every design decision about shielding involves a careful balance between how much protection is provided and what the mass consequences of that protection are. The ship's crew will receive more radiation over their lifetimes than people on Earth. The question is how much more, and whether that excess can be held to a level compatible with maintaining a healthy population across the full voyage. Space is not empty either in the purely physical sense. It contains dust grains and small particles traveling at whatever velocity they happen to have relative to the ship. A particle the size of a grain of sand meeting a hull at several miles per second carries considerable energy. Over centuries of travel, a generation ship's exterior will be struck by these particles continuously. Most impacts are negligible, but any statistical distribution of impact events includes those large enough to penetrate outer hull layers. Multi-layered hull designs address this. A series of thin outer shields that cause incoming particles to fragment and spread before they can deliver their full energy to the structural hull beneath. The Whipple shield, developed in the 1940s by astronomer Fred Whipple, uses exactly this approach. A thin outer bumper sheet set away from the main hull causes incoming particles to vaporize and disperse before reaching the interior. Modern spacecraft use refined versions of this design, and a generation ship's exterior would incorporate advanced iterations across every surface. Over centuries, though, the outer hull layers accumulate damage. Bumper shields erode. The hull develops microscopic fatigue. All of it needs to be inspectable and repairable by people whose relationship to the original engineering is entirely historical. Anyone alive at the moment of a serious hull breach may be 12 generations removed from the engineers who drew up the original specifications. They must understand the structure well enough to address it effectively, with whatever materials and knowledge they have under pressure. And this brings us back, always, to what is perhaps the deepest and most underappreciated challenge of all. Knowledge. A modern spacecraft is built by thousands of engineers across hundreds of disciplines. The understanding required to design, build, and operate it is distributed across an entire industrial civilization. When something goes wrong, you call the manufacturer. You consult specialists. You have access to the full accumulated technical knowledge of humanity through communication with Earth. A generation ship in interstellar space has none of that. Signals from Earth take years each way. The knowledge base that keeps the ship alive must exist entirely within the ship itself, not only in computer systems, but in the minds and practiced hands of the people aboard. Because computer systems fail. Data can be corrupted through radiation damage and hardware decay. Storage media that is reliable for decades may not be reliable for centuries, and reading a manual about how to repair a complex system is not the same as actually knowing how to repair it. There is a meaningful difference between information and knowledge. Information is data stored on a medium. Knowledge is understanding held within a trained human mind that can be applied flexibly. That can adapt when the textbook scenario does not match what is actually happening. That can improvise from principles when the procedure as written reaches its limits. A generation ship needs that kind of knowledge, deep and practical and flexible, across the full range of systems that keep it functioning. Reactor physics, biological life support, water and waste chemistry, agricultural ecology, medicine in all its breadth, materials science, navigation, hull engineering, computer systems, manufacturing and fabrication. And it needs that knowledge to remain equally alive in the 7th generation as it was in the first. Not preserved only in written form, but practiced, passed on by doing, transmitted as living skill rather than stored as archived procedure. There is a concept in anthropology called cultural transmission fidelity. The degree to which knowledge and practice pass accurately from one generation to the next. On Earth, we maintain this accuracy through universities, trade schools, apprenticeship traditions, professional communities, libraries, peer review, and the ability to consult with experts anywhere on the planet. These institutions evolved over thousands of years precisely because accurate transmission of complex knowledge does not happen automatically. It requires deliberate, ongoing investment to maintain. A generation ship would need to build an equivalent for a society of a few thousand people, covering the entire range of technical knowledge necessary to keep the ship alive. A rigorous educational framework spanning every critical system. A culture of mentorship deeply enough embedded to survive generational change. An ethic that treats technical competence as a survival imperative rather than merely a career path. And that culture would need to hold with the same reliability as the reactor containment walls, because the failure mode of knowledge loss does not announce itself with an alarm. It happens quietly across generations until the day someone opens a panel on a system they are supposed to understand and finds, with a cold and growing unease, that they do not actually know what they are looking at. There is something that generation ship theorists call mission drift. The founding generation knows why they are on the ship. They lived on Earth. They made a deliberate choice to leave. The destination is real to them because the world they left behind was real to them. They carry the weight of that choice in everything they do. The second generation grows up aboard the ship. They have no memory of Earth. Their parents speak of it. They learn about it in study. But it is a story told by people who grew up somewhere else. An account of a world they have never experienced. The third and fourth generations are further removed still. Earth becomes history. As distant and perhaps as mythologized as the Roman Empire is to someone alive today. The destination becomes a vague promise their great-grandparents made on behalf of everyone who would come after. The mission, the obligation to maintain the ship, to hold the course, to arrive, is something they inherited rather than chose. Sustaining commitment to a long-horizon goal across generations is among the hardest things any human institution has ever attempted. Religions have managed it over centuries and millennia. Cultural traditions have been preserved across time. But religions and enduring traditions succeed because they offer something felt as larger than any individual life. They give people a reason to carry the tradition that is not merely obligation, but genuine meaning. A generation ship needs something equivalent. A shared framework of meaning that makes the voyage feel worthy of its demands across generations that will never see its completion. Not enforced compliance, not institutional pressure, but something people can genuinely hold and genuinely pass on to their children as worth holding. Something that makes the purpose of the voyage feel real to someone born in year 150 of the flight, who has never looked up at stars from a planetary surface and never will. This is as much a question of culture as it is of governance. Of story and ritual and shared practice, of making the mission feel, across every generation that will never see it completed, like something worth being part of anyway. One partial technical response to some of these human challenges is the idea of suspended animation. If human beings could be placed into a state of dramatically reduced metabolic activity, slowed heart rate, lowered body temperature, suspended awareness, it might be possible to carry a crew across a centuries-long voyage without all of them living through it in real time. A rotating watch crew could be kept active for maintenance and monitoring while the rest remained in a deep physiological rest, not experiencing the passage of time, not accumulating the psychological weight of prolonged confinement, not aging at normal rate. Arriving at the destination without the full generational burden of having lived a complete civilization aboard the ship. The concept is appealing. The biological reality is considerably more nuanced. True suspended animation in human beings does not currently exist. Medical hypothermia, cooling the body to protect patients during surgery or cardiac events, does exist, and people can safely survive temperatures of around 28 degrees Celsius, that is about 82 degrees Fahrenheit, for periods of hours. Research has been exploring whether this can be extended to days, with some early promising results in animal studies, but weeks, months, years, or centuries of metabolic suspension, followed by full recovery of cognitive and biological function, has not been demonstrated in any form. The fundamental difficulty is that cells do not simply slow down cleanly when cooled. Ice crystal formation damages cell membranes in ways that can be lethal. The chemical processes that sustain cellular function do not all decelerate proportionally with temperature, creating imbalances that accumulate as damage. Vitrification, replacing the water in tissues with compounds that form a glass-like state rather than ice crystals, is a technique used to preserve certain cells and embryos. But applying this to an entire living human being, and then reversing it, involves every organ system simultaneously, each with different requirements and different tolerances. The brain in particular is extraordinarily sensitive to the cellular disruption that cryogenic processes produce, and it is precisely the last organ anyone wants functioning below its best when people wake needing to run a ship. Research continues. There are serious scientists working on long-duration human torpor, and some clinical work in managed medical contexts has explored deep hypothermia carefully. Progress is real, if measured. But for a generation ship designed and launched within any foreseeable window, suspended animation cannot be assumed to be reliably available. The design must account for people living full lives aboard the vessel, with all the generational, psychological, genetic, and social dimensions that reality entails. Some proposals sidestep the population biology problem altogether by changing what the ship carries. Seed ships. Not living human beings, but frozen embryos, cryopreserved reproductive material. Or even just the digital sequences needed to reconstruct human biology at the destination. The raw genetic material to seed a population at the far end rather than carry a living population the whole way. A seed ship would be dramatically smaller and simpler than a full generation ship. Less mass, less power, less life support complexity. It could potentially be built more quickly and travel faster. At the destination, an automated system would initiate the embryos, care for the resulting children in an artificial environment, and gradually establish a human presence on the new world. The ethical complexities here are considerable. You are bringing human beings into existence with no parents, no living community, no cultural inheritance, no one to tell them what things mean or how the world works beyond what an automated system was programmed to say. The children who emerge at the other end would know themselves as created by a machine from material that crossed the void. They would have no living elders, no oral tradition, no one to model what it means to be human in terms beyond what a system could provide. They would be biologically human in every respect. But they would be human in circumstances that have no precedent in any formative experience our species has ever encountered. The engineering complexity is also enormous. Artificial care and education systems would need to function without failure across centuries, adapting to circumstances their designers could not fully anticipate, and producing healthy, psychologically whole adults from infants with no adult community around them other than whatever the automated systems provided. There is also a version of this concept where frozen embryos are carried aboard a conventional generation ship not as the primary population, but as a genetic reserve. A library of potential people who could be brought into existence if catastrophic population loss threatened the mission's viability. This raises questions of its own. Who decides when to activate that reserve, by what criteria, under what authority, and with what consideration for the lives of those who would emerge from it? These are not unanswerable questions. But they require considered answers before the ship launches, built into whatever governance structure it carries. The question of what happens at the destination deserves as much careful thought as what happens during the journey itself. A generation ship approaching a target star after 2 or 3 centuries of travel is not arriving at a verified habitable world. We can study candidate systems from here using telescopes and spectroscopy. We can determine whether a planet has the right mass and orbital distance from its star. We can analyze its atmospheric chemistry for signs of water vapor, oxygen, carbon dioxide. We can look for biosignatures, chemical indicators that might suggest biological activity. The James Webb Space Telescope has already begun demonstrating what is possible in this area, examining exoplanet atmospheres from our current position in the solar system with a precision that would have seemed extraordinary only a decade before. But we cannot know with certainty from trillions of miles away whether a world is genuinely livable, whether its surface gravity is comfortable for human bodies, whether its day length is compatible with human biology, whether its native microbiology would be benign or dangerous, whether its mineral chemistry would support agriculture, whether its weather patterns include anything severe enough to pose an immediate threat. The ship arrives. The people look at this new world, a colored sphere hanging in a sky that is not Earth's sky, orbiting a star subtly different from the one their ancestors departed from, and they must decide. Is it safe to send people down? Can a community survive here? Should we go? This decision is made by people who have spent their entire lives in deep space, who have never stood on solid ground with an open sky above them, who know what planetary surfaces are like only through recordings made centuries ago on a world none of them have ever experienced. The planet below might be beautiful. It might have an atmosphere nearly suited for human life, liquid water, something that could be photosynthesis in whatever passes for green on its surface. Or it might be subtly hostile in ways that will only become apparent after people have committed to being there, the choice to descend, to leave the ship that has been the entire world of their civilization for 3 centuries, is among the most consequential decisions any group of human beings has ever faced. And they will make it with information that can never be quite complete, knowing the ship cannot easily return them, knowing their descendants will live with whatever they choose. There is a version of the generation ship story in which everything holds together. The ship launches with a well-designed population, sufficient genetic diversity, robust and redundant life support, a thoughtful governance structure, and a culture that manages somehow to preserve both technical knowledge and shared purpose across the centuries. Generations come and go. Conflicts arise and are resolved by processes the community trusts. Systems fail and are repaired by people who were trained well and who trained their own successors equally well. Knowledge passes from the old to the young without critical losses. The agricultural systems produce enough. The reactors keep running. The air stays breathable, and the water clean. The genetic diversity remains sufficient, and the people aboard, not the same people, never the same people, but a continuous human community, maintain enough coherence and purpose to keep moving forward. The stars shift almost imperceptibly in the cameras facing forward across the decades and the centuries. And then, in the lifetime of the 7th generation, or the 9th, or the 12th, one star grows perceptibly brighter than the others year by year. The course adjusts. The long deceleration begins, trading velocity for the ability to stop rather than fly past. A planetary system resolves itself from a point of light into a collection of distinct worlds. And among them, neither too close to the star nor too far, there is a planet with blue and white and brown in its colouring, and perhaps the faintest suggestion of something green. Not Earth, but something. The people who stand at those cameras and look at that planet are the products of centuries of isolation, adaptation, and survival. Genuinely human, fully human, but shaped by a world their ancestors would find unrecognizable. Ready, or as ready as anyone could be, for what comes next. The version of the story that does not go well has many possible shapes. Some are abrupt. A reactor failure that cannot be contained in time. A hull breach in a critical section that the people alive at that moment lack the knowledge or materials to repair. A disease spreading rapidly through a population that has been isolated long enough to have lost the broad immune exposure that living communities on Earth maintain through constant microbial contact. Those are the dramatic failure modes. They make for compelling storytelling, but the more realistic ones tend to be slower and quieter. A gradual erosion of technical knowledge over generations until critical systems are operated by people who understand the procedures but not the underlying principles. Who can follow the checklist but cannot diagnose the problem when the checklist reaches the end of what it covers. A cultural drift away from the founding purpose until the ship's society no longer agrees, or no longer cares, whether arriving at the destination is something they want. A genetic bottleneck from a period of population stress, a disease outbreak, a period of low fertility, an accident that disproportionately affected one genetic line, that reduces diversity enough for its effects to accumulate quietly across the generations that follow. A governance failure that produces a factional conflict the community lacks the institutional tools to resolve before it becomes something that pulls the community apart. These slow failures are harder to see coming and harder to correct once underway. They do not trigger alarms. They accumulate across decades, visible only in retrospect as a trajectory that has been bending the wrong way for a long time. Preventing them requires the living generation to take seriously the implications of trends that have not yet become crises. To act on projections rather than waiting for emergencies. That kind of institutional foresight is rare in human societies. Building it into a generation ship community and sustaining it across centuries is perhaps the most ambitious social design challenge the whole enterprise involves. Researchers who think seriously about these problems have proposed various frameworks. Some suggest a city-state model in which the ship is divided into semi-autonomous communities sharing critical infrastructure but maintaining significant local governance. This prevents power from concentrating in a single authority that could become isolated from the realities of daily life in different parts of the ship. It creates social diversity and, with it, resilience. If one community encounters serious difficulties, the others do not necessarily fall with it. Others have proposed deliberate cultural design. Not the engineering of compliance, but the careful construction of rituals, stories, institutions, and symbols that reinforce the ship's purpose and the community's sense of shared identity across generations. The way that militaries build unit cohesion through shared ceremony. The way that long-lived traditions preserve identity across centuries through practices that genuinely connect each living generation to the ones before. The crew would need art, music, literature, sport, play, creative expression, and the space to genuinely be human in ways that are not purely functional. These things are not luxuries to be permitted if resources allow. They are necessities. A society that loses its cultural vitality, that becomes purely transactional and procedural, loses something essential long before any physical system fails. It loses the psychological resilience to endure the hard years, the motivation to pass along not just technical capability, but meaning. The belief that arriving somewhere and building something new is worth whatever the journey has cost. The scale of the ship itself creates one of the central tensions in generation ship design. Larger populations are more genetically and socially robust. More people means more genetic diversity, more resilience against the bottlenecks that threaten small, isolated communities, more specialists, more redundancy in critical knowledge. But larger ships are harder to build, harder to power, and harder to accelerate to the velocities needed for interstellar travel within any meaningful time frame. The figure from the population genetics literature, around 40,000 people as a minimum, would require a ship of genuinely staggering size. A structure carrying 40,000 people alongside all of their agricultural systems. Water and air recycling infrastructure, reactor systems, medical facilities, workshops, schools, cultural spaces, and everything else a functioning civilization requires would have mass measured in millions of metric tons. Accelerating that to even a fraction of a percent of the speed of light requires energy that is far beyond anything currently within human capability. One proposed architecture addresses this by replacing the single ship with a fleet. Multiple vessels traveling together close enough to communicate and assist each other regularly, far enough apart that a single catastrophic failure does not end the mission in one event. Crew can transfer between ships as needed. Genetic material can be shared to prevent individual ship populations from narrowing independently. Resources can be redistributed if production systems on one ship outperform those on another. If one ship suffers a serious systems failure, the others can provide emergency support. This approach dramatically improves the overall resilience of the mission. The loss of one ship becomes a profound tragedy rather than a mission-ending catastrophe. It also dramatically increases the cost and complexity of the initial launch. But from a survival standpoint, a fleet of 10 or 20 moderately sized ships is far more robust than a single vessel carrying all the same people and all the same single points of failure. Before continuing with the human dimensions of this, it is worth considering the physics of the voyage itself in a little more concrete detail, because the constraints that physics imposes shape every other decision. A light year is the distance that light travels in a year, moving at roughly 186,000 miles per second. Proxima Centauri, our nearest stellar neighbor, is 4.24 light-years away. The Alpha Centauri system, a pair of sun-like stars orbiting each other that is part of the same triple star system, lies at the same distance. Tau Ceti, a sun-like star with a confirmed planetary system and considerable scientific interest, is about 11.9 light-years away. At the velocity of the fastest probes ever to leave our solar system, around 38,000 miles per hour. These distances translate into travel times that are practically beyond imagination. Roughly 70,000 years to Proxima Centauri, more than 200,000 years to Tau Ceti. Those are not generation timescales. They are evolutionary timescales. Any realistic generation ship scenario requires propulsion far beyond anything we currently have. A nuclear pulse propulsion system of the kind studied in the 1950s and 60s under Project Orion, which worked by detonating nuclear warheads behind a large pusher plate, could, in principle, reach a few percent of the speed of light. At 1% of light speed, Proxima Centauri is about 430 years away. At 5%, roughly 85 years. At 10%, approximately 40 to 45 years. Those are the actual timescales under discussion for serious interstellar missions using nuclear propulsion. Decades to centuries, depending on the destination and the propulsion capability. Most serious proposals fall somewhere between 50 years at minimum and a few hundred years for destinations beyond the nearest systems. That is the window a generation ship must be designed to survive. Not tens of thousands of years, but still long enough that the people who launch the ship will not be the ones who arrive. The deceleration problem is as significant as the acceleration problem. A ship moving at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light carries enormous kinetic energy. Stopping takes as much effort as getting up to speed, and unlike acceleration, which can in principle be applied gradually over time, deceleration requires either reserved fuel for a full reverse burn, a magnetic sail that gradually bleeds off speed by interacting with the interstellar medium, or careful gravitational capture maneuvers using the destination star and its planets. Each approach has its trade-offs. The reverse burn roughly doubles the total fuel requirement of the mission. Magnetic sail braking works gradually and requires maintaining large, delicate structures for extended periods. Gravitational braking is only available once the ship is already in the destination system and requires precise navigation through an environment whose configuration will not be fully known until arrival. A ship that launches without a credible plan for deceleration is committing its passengers to a flyby of the destination, passing through at high speed with no ability to stop. That is not a mission. That is a very elaborate way to travel a very long way and accomplish nothing. Navigation in interstellar space also deserves its own careful attention, because it is a domain that receives less consideration than it merits. There are no GPS satellites in the space between stars, no ground stations, no continuous contact with mission control providing course corrections. A generation ship navigates by measuring the apparent positions of known stars and calculating its position and velocity from those measurements. This approach, often called celestial navigation, has deep roots. Sailors relied on the stars for millennia before modern technology. But stellar navigation is different in important ways. As the ship moves, the apparent positions of stars shift due to parallax, the change in viewing angle produced by the ship's changing position. The faster the ship moves and the further it travels, the more pronounced these shifts become. The star field visible from deep interstellar space looks meaningfully different from the star field visible from Earth. The navigation systems must account for this precisely. They must measure stellar positions with extraordinary accuracy, compute the ship's position from those measurements. Compare that position to the intended course and calculate any corrections needed. A small navigational error early in the voyage, left uncorrected, can result in the ship arriving at entirely the wrong location after decades of travel. The destination is a very small target in an immeasurable void. The people responsible for navigation in Generation 150 of the voyage cannot afford to be less capable at this than the people in Generation 1. The instruments must be maintained to the same precision. The methods must be understood with the same depth. The culture of rigor around navigation must be as strong in the final decades of the approach as it was at the moment of departure. The destination star, when the mission is being planned, is well characterized. Powerful telescopes can measure its spectrum, luminosity, and mass. They can identify planets using transit photometry and radial velocity measurements, characterize their sizes and orbital periods, and in some cases begin to examine their atmospheric compositions. But we cannot see the destination system as it will be when the ship arrives. If the voyage takes 250 years, all those observations are 250 years old by arrival. Stars change over time. Their activity levels vary across decades and centuries. Planets have seasons and weather and geological processes. A world that looked promising from Earth might, on arrival, be in a different phase of its climate cycle, might be showing more cloud cover than early observations suggested, might have experienced volcanic activity that altered its atmospheric chemistry. None of this can be known in advance. The ship must carry its own instruments capable of characterizing the destination system as it approaches, and the expertise to use those instruments properly, and the capacity to make consequential decisions based on what is found, without waiting for confirmation from Earth. Because any response from Earth will arrive years later than the moment it is needed. Full autonomy, genuine decision-making capability within the ship's own community is not an optional feature. It is required by the physics of communication delay. For the early part of the voyage, communication with Earth remains possible with manageable delay. But as the ship moves further into interstellar space, the delay grows. At 1 light year, messages take a year each way. At 2 light years, 2 years. By the time the ship is halfway to its destination, any communication from Earth is years old on arrival, and any reply will be equally delayed in return. Practical guidance for real-time decisions becomes impossible very early in the voyage. What communication with Earth can provide, for as long as it remains possible, is something more like cultural continuity. News from the world the mission came from. New science, new art, human voices from a place that grows more distant with every passing year. These connections have real psychological value. They remind the people aboard that they are part of something beyond the ship's own walls. But transmitting from interstellar distances requires enormous power and highly directional equipment. At some point in the voyage, the signal from Earth becomes too faint to receive reliably. Not suddenly, not on any specific date. Gradually, over years, the voices from home grow quieter, the news arrives later and later, the cultural threads thin. And eventually the ship becomes, for all practical purposes, an independent civilization. The only civilization it has. This transition from connected mission to isolated community is one of the most psychologically significant passages in the voyage. It probably needs to be anticipated, prepared for, and acknowledged in some way the community can process, because it is a genuine loss. and losses that go unacknowledged tend to find expression in other forms. The question of children born on the ship is central to everything. Children are not incidental to the generation ship concept. They are the mechanism by which the mission continues past any single lifetime. They are the reason the ship can function across more than one generation. But they are also people who chose none of this, who arrive in a world quite unlike anything their biology was shaped to expect, who grow up beneath a sky that does not move, in wind that comes from vents, in seasons defined by the ship's own systems rather than by an orbit around a star. What the research on developmental psychology in constrained and artificial environments consistently suggests is that children are remarkably adaptable within their formative settings. They calibrate to what is normal based on what they experience. A child raised on a generation ship will not experience the absence of open sky the way an adult who grew up on Earth and then transferred to the ship would. The ship's environment is simply the world to them, the way any child's environment is simply the world before they have a basis for comparison. This is both reassuring and quietly significant. It means the children will likely cope. It also means they will be genuinely different from their parents in ways that reflect their formative experience. The first generation aboard retains its connection to Earth through lived memory, through the felt knowledge of what an open world is like. The second has that connection only through what their parents tell them. The third only through what their grandparents told their parents, and so it passes on down. By the fifth or sixth generation, Earth is not a place anyone remembers. It is a concept, a story, an origin. What that shift means for motivation, for cultural cohesion, for the psychological relationship to the mission is genuinely uncertain. The health challenges specific to growing up in an artificial, closed environment are not trivial. The human immune system develops in part through contact with diverse microbial environments. Children who grow up in very controlled conditions can develop immune systems calibrated differently from those of people raised in contact with the biological richness of a natural world. The hygiene hypothesis in immunology suggests that some modern immune conditions may be related to reduced early life microbial exposure. A generation ship is, by definition, a closed environment with a limited and managed microbial community. The children born there will have immune systems shaped by whatever microbiome the ship contains. The ship's biological systems ideally would maintain a diverse and healthy microbial ecosystem, not a sterile environment, but a thoughtfully managed one. The microbiome of the ship is as much a life support concern as the oxygen content of the air. The musculoskeletal development of children also depends on appropriate gravitational loading during growth. If artificial gravity is well calibrated to Earth normal, this should not present a serious problem. But any deviation, a lower effective gravity, uneven distribution, periods without gravity during propulsion phases can affect bone density and muscle development in ways that compound across generations. Vision is another consideration. Human vision develops in response to the visual environment during childhood. Children who spend their formative years in environments with limited long-distance vision, limited outdoor time, predominantly indoor lighting at close ranges, show higher rates of myopia. The architectural design of the ship's living spaces and the deliberate creation of areas with sufficient visual range to support healthy vision development in children is a genuine medical consideration. There are people alive today who think seriously about all of these problems. Not because a generation ship is about to be built, but because rigorous study of what it would require generates insights relevant to more immediate challenges. Closed ecological systems research inspired by generation ship concepts has direct applications for lunar and Mars habitats. Population genetics work on minimum viable crew sizes informs the design of any long-duration mission within our own solar system. Psychology research on long-duration isolation applies directly to multi-year missions that space agencies are actively planning. Governance frameworks for autonomous deep space communities have implications for any future settlement that must function independently of Earth. In this sense, the generation ship is not merely a science fiction concept waiting for some far future. It is an intellectual forcing function. A way of asking questions hard enough that the answers are useful even before the question becomes practical. NASA and ESA have both sponsored research into the human factors of long-duration missions. The one-year mission in which astronaut Scott Kelly and cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko spent 340 days aboard the International Space Station in 2015 and 2016 was designed in part to examine the effects of extended space habitation. The findings were significant. Both astronauts showed measurable changes in vision, immune function, gut microbiome composition, gene expression, and cognitive performance over the course of the year. Scott Kelly's twin brother Mark, also an astronaut but not aboard the station, provided a control for the biological comparisons. The results pointed clearly to the need for a far deeper understanding of long-duration human spaceflight before any mission of multi-year or multi-decade length could be undertaken safely. A generation ship, even at the most optimistic timescale, involves not 1 year in space, but decades or centuries. The biological challenge is categorically different in scale. Some generation ship proposals address the psychological challenge at the level of the architecture itself. If the central problem is that people live in a closed metal world with no natural sky, no weather, no open space, one response is to build those things into the ship. O'Neill cylinders proposed by physicist Gerard Kay. O'Neill in the 1970s are large rotating habitat structures in which the rotation produces centrifugal acceleration that functions as artificial gravity on the inner surface. With a cylinder several miles in length and more than a mile in diameter, you can fit something that genuinely resembles a landscape inside. Real terrain with soil, trees, and bodies of water. Atmospheric circulation, weather produced by the management systems of the cylinder itself. A sky that is curved in the way the cylinder curves, but genuinely open rather than a ceiling a short distance above your head. Open spaces large enough that you cannot immediately see the far wall. The psychological difference between living in a pressurized corridor and living in a space large enough to feel like a real landscape would likely be profound, and very probably important for maintaining mental health across the generations of the voyage. Whether it is sufficient to prevent all the long-term effects of knowing the sky is a machine, knowing you cannot leave. Knowing your entire world is a vessel moving through the dark is an open question, but it addresses the most immediate and visceral elements of the confinement problem. Rotating habitat designs also address the gravity question directly. Long-term exposure to low gravity or weightlessness causes loss of bone density, muscle mass, and cardiovascular function. Fluid distribution in the body changes in problematic ways. The immune system is affected. These effects accumulate over years and decades in ways incompatible with maintaining a healthy population across generations. A rotating cylinder provides constant centrifugal acceleration that the body experiences as gravity. It is not perfectly identical to planetary gravity in every physical detail, but for large cylinder radii, the differences become biologically negligible. The children who will be born on a generation ship, raised in its environment, trained in its technical demands, socialized within its culture, will be different from the people who launched it. Not transformed into something unrecognizable, but genuinely different in ways that any formative environment reliably produces in human beings. Their bodies will be calibrated to the ship's gravity, its atmospheric composition, its light cycles, its microbial community. Their psychology will reflect having never known wilderness, never having been genuinely alone in any meaningful sense, never having encountered a world that operates by processes outside human control. Their values and intuitions will reflect what their community taught them about what matters. The founders of the mission cannot fully predict what a person 7 or 10 generations removed from the launch will be like. They can design institutions and culture and physical spaces they believe will produce capable, mission-oriented, psychologically healthy people. But human development is not engineering. It is biology and culture and individual variation producing outcomes that are always somewhat surprising. After 10 generations, the population of a generation ship will be genuinely unprecedented in human history. People shaped by circumstances no human being has ever faced before. There is something worth sitting quietly with in that. The decision to launch a generation ship is a decision to bring into existence people who had no voice in being created under those conditions, who will live and work and love and age within the walls of a vessel they did not choose. Every generation is born into circumstances not of its choosing, of course. That is true on Earth as surely as aboard any ship. But the generation ship version is more deliberate, more total, more final. You are making choices for people who do not yet exist, choosing their entire world for them before they are born, with the understanding that it will be the only world they ever have. That weight, that responsibility, is something every generation ship proposal eventually has to reckon with, not necessarily as a reason against building one, but as something requiring honesty. Before we reach the final reckoning, there is a dimension of the generation ship problem that rarely receives the attention it deserves. Manufacturing a generation ship is, at its foundation, a machine, a very large and very complex one, and machines break. Not only the reactors and the life support systems, everything, the pumps in the water recycling systems, the electric motors in the agricultural systems, the seals in pressurized compartments, the bearings in rotating habitat sections, the filtration membranes in the water processors, the circuit boards in the control systems, the lighting systems, the medical equipment, the fabrication tools themselves. Every component on the ship has a finite service life. When that life ends, the component must be replaced. For the first decade of the voyage, the ship carries spares. For the next several decades, it uses those spares while manufacturing new ones with onboard fabrication capability. But eventually, the fabrication equipment wears out too, and the materials it uses are consumed, and the knowledge of how to maintain the fabrication equipment has to be carried alongside the knowledge of how to use it. A generation ship without comprehensive manufacturing capability is a generation ship on a deadline, using up what it has without being able to replenish it. On a voyage measured in centuries, a critical component will eventually fail with no spare available and no manufacturer to call. If the fabrication equipment is functional and the people operating it understand what they need to produce, the crisis is manageable. If either of those conditions is missing, it becomes something worse. The manufacturing requirements constitute an engineering program in their own right: metalworking, polymer synthesis and processing, electronics fabrication, glass and ceramic production, biological material production for medical applications, textile production for suits and seals and filtration materials. The ship needs to be, in a meaningful sense, a small industrial civilization, not dependent on any external supply chain. And the people running that industrial capability need to understand it at the level of principle, not just procedure. They need to understand why a metallurgical process produces the result it does, not merely the steps to follow. Because the day will come when those steps as written do not match what is actually happening, and someone will need to reason from first principles. The legal and ethical framework of a generation ship is something that civilization theorists have been exploring with increasing seriousness, because a generation ship creates conditions for which no existing legal framework was designed. The people aboard are citizens of the mission, not citizens of any Earth nation in any practical sense. The laws of the countries that funded and launched the ship have no enforcement mechanism beyond the hull. The ship's own governance structure is the only operative authority. Property on a generation ship is a particularly interesting problem. In most legal frameworks, property rights are ultimately backed by a state that can enforce them. On a generation ship, enforcement is entirely internal. The community must believe in and enforce property rights through its own institutions. And the nature of property aboard is different from property on Earth. Everything is in some sense shared. The air, the water, the food systems. But individual ownership of personal possessions, creative work, living spaces must be defined and protected if people are to experience any meaningful sense of personal autonomy. A system too communal becomes oppressive. A system too individualistic creates inequalities that, in a closed environment, become sources of resentment that have nowhere to go. Finding the right balance and maintaining the flexibility for that balance to evolve across centuries is not a simple problem. The treatment of serious wrongdoing presents its own difficulties. On Earth, one response to people who harm others is incarceration, removing them from the community for a period. On a generation ship where every person is a resource and space is finite, long-term incarceration is wasteful at best. And there is nowhere to exile anyone to. The ship cannot banish someone without putting them outside in space, which is not a proportionate response to most categories of wrongdoing. Restorative justice frameworks, community-based approaches to rehabilitation, the careful management of people who are dangerous without the option of simply removing them, all require serious design and institutionalization before the ship launches. There are historical analogies for some of what a generation ship community would face, though none map perfectly. Pacific Island populations that settled new islands across the ocean thousands of years ago developed distinct cultures, languages, and technologies from their common ancestral base. Separated by great distances of water, they became genuinely different peoples, sharing deep roots, but expressing those roots in quite different ways. A generation ship would produce something similar. A culture rooted in the founding community, but evolved by the specific pressures and conditions of the voyage. The early colonial expeditions offer another partial parallel. Small communities cut off from their home societies, required to be self-sufficient in ways their culture had not previously demanded, under conditions of genuine stress and uncertainty. They survived when they survived through adaptive problem-solving, social cohesion, and enough good fortune that the crises they could not handle did not arrive at the worst moments, and they frequently did not survive. The historical record of colonial ventures includes communities that simply collapsed. The generation ship is orders of magnitude more demanding than any terrestrial colonial venture. More extreme conditions, more complete isolation, greater duration, and a more absolute inability to receive emergency support from outside. History suggests that the communities which survive under these kinds of conditions are those that adapt their culture to their circumstances while preserving the core competencies they cannot afford to lose. Not the ones that insist on doing everything exactly as it was done before, regardless of changing conditions. But also not the ones that lose their technical foundations while adapting their social surface. Both kinds of failure are real. Both can be the end. The emotional weight of all of this is worth acknowledging directly. A generation ship is not only an engineering project, it is a human story of extraordinary dimensions. The people who board it are making a choice no human being has ever made before. They are choosing to leave not just a country or a continent, but their entire world. Every person they have ever known, except those also boarding the ship, will be left behind. Every landscape they have ever loved, the sky they have known their whole lives, the smell of rain and soil and sea, none of it comes with them. And they know, on the day they board, that they will never encounter any of it again. That is a grief with no adequate comparison in human experience. The closest analogy is emigration from a deeply loved place, knowing return is impossible. But even that falls short. The emigrant can still look up at the same sun, breathe air that has moved across the same planet, receive news from the place they came from. The generation ship passenger loses the sun, loses the sky, loses the connection in a way that is more total than anything our history has produced language for. And yet people would board. People have always been capable of extraordinary sacrifice when they genuinely believe in what they are sacrificing for. The founders of difficult colonies, the people who committed themselves to long and dangerous expeditions into the unknown. Individuals in every era who traded the familiar and the comfortable for the chance to be part of something that felt larger than a single ordinary life. They existed in every generation. The generation ship would draw exactly those people. People for whom the prospect of standing at the beginning of humanity's first interstellar civilization outweighs the profound cost of what they leave behind. People who find meaning not in comfort and familiarity, but in the frontier, the unknown, the chance to go somewhere no human being has ever been. And their children would inherit not just the ship, but the choice their parents made, would grow up in a community shaped by that choice, by the culture of people who believed strongly enough in something to give up everything ordinary for it. That cultural inheritance, the ethos of people who committed to the seemingly impossible, might be one of the most important things the founders could pass on. Not just the ship and the knowledge of how to run it, but the spirit of why it was worth building in the first place. The question of which star to aim for has occupied astronomers and space mission planners considerably. Proxima Centauri b, the planet confirmed in 2016 as orbiting within Proxima Centauri's habitable zone, is the most discussed candidate. But Proxima Centauri is a red dwarf. Red dwarfs are common, making up roughly 3/4 of all stars in the galaxy. They burn their hydrogen fuel for trillions of years, but they are prone to intense stellar flares, and the planets in their habitable zones are close enough to their stars to be very likely tidally locked, one face permanently turned toward the star and one permanently away. This creates extreme temperature differentials and unusual atmospheric behavior. Whether these conditions could support human life is genuinely open. Tau Ceti is more appealing in some respects. A sun-like star similar enough to our own that its habitable zone would offer conditions closer to what we are designed for. It has a confirmed planetary system, though the confirmed planets are larger than Earth and may not be the most promising targets. At nearly 12 light-years distance, it represents a more demanding journey. Further destinations in the galaxy's population of sun-like stars require correspondingly longer voyages. The choice of destination is not purely an astronomical decision. It is a decision about voyage length, destination conditions, and therefore what the ship and its people must be prepared to face at the end. The reconnaissance work done before launch, using the most powerful telescopes available, is as important as the engineering of the ship itself. Because the best-built ship in history, arriving somewhere it cannot support a living community, has brought its people a very long way for nothing. The question the title of this exploration poses is not answered by engineering alone. And before the final reckoning, it is worth pausing briefly to appreciate the full scope of what we have moved through together. We have considered reactors that must run for centuries, maintained by people born long after they were assembled. Biological life support systems that must function as complete ecosystems, understood by a population with no university departments to consult. Genetics and population size, and the quiet slow-motion risk of bottlenecks that accumulate invisibly until they appear in fertility statistics. Food production that must absorb failure without cascading. Water recycling that must work continuously for centuries. Medical systems that must cover everything with no outside specialist care available. All of this is the generation ship. Not just the spacecraft, the civilization inside it. And the civilization is the harder engineering problem. It is not only whether the reactors hold or whether the air stays breathable. It is whether a small, isolated, centuries-long slice of human civilization can carry the weight of its own situation. Whether people can sustain the fragile web of trust and competence and shared purpose that separates a functioning society from one that is slowly coming apart. Whether the meaning of the mission can survive the centuries between departure and arrival. The honest answer, based on everything we know about biology and psychology and social dynamics and engineering and history, is that it might be possible, not guaranteed, not even necessarily likely without everything going very right, but possible, under carefully designed conditions, with extraordinary governance, extraordinary luck, and a founding culture that somehow finds a way to pass on not only the ship and the knowledge, but the will to use both. And in the context of interstellar travel, possible is genuinely a significant word. Because everything that makes the stars even conceivable as a destination is barely possible. The energy requirements, the materials, the biological systems, the centuries of human endurance, all of it sitting right at the edge of what can be imagined and done. And here is something gently worth carrying with you as we near the end of tonight's journey. In a quiet and perhaps rather beautiful way, we are already aboard a generation ship. Earth itself is a sealed world, drifting through the dark, carrying everything we need to survive inside a thin shell of air and water and rock. Our ecosystems recycle our air and water. Our sun provides the energy. Generations are born, live fully, and move on. Each one inheriting a world they did not make and handing it forward to those who come next. We have no resupply vessel waiting. We have no rescue mission on its way. If we damage our life support, if we poison our air or exhaust what we have been given, there is no outside, and no one is coming to help. The lessons of the generation ship are, in the deepest sense, the lessons of living here. The stars are 25 trillion miles away. And the hardest distance in all of that journey is not the physical one. It is the distance between what we wish ourselves to be and what we actually are. That is the distance a generation ship must close. And if we ever manage to get the physics and the engineering right, the real question, the one that will determine whether anyone arrives, is whether we can close that one too. Good night.